What is Celtic paganism? Hi folks, Falcha. Today we're going to tackle one of those phrases that gets thrown around constantly online, Celtic paganism. Now, people use it for everything from actual historical cultures to modern witchcraft aesthetics to racist crap and nonsense about pure Celtic blood. So, in this mini class, we are going to slow that right down and ask some basic questions. What does Celtic actually mean in real world terms? What do we know about pre-Christian religious life in those cultures? And where does modern Celtic paganism fit into all of that, if it does at all? I'm talking to you as an Irish pagan who lives here on this island of Ireland, who grew up in the culture here and who has spent decades working in Irish heritage, archaeology adjacent fields and community education. So my practice is rooted in the Irish strand of that wider story. I also have a master's in Irish history. So I'm going to give you a grounded overview and then you can decide what is actually useful for your own spiritual path and what needs to go in the recycling bin. Before we go any further, we really need some common language. First, Celtic. I am going to use that as a big umbrella label for a group of related cultures in Iron Age and early medieval Europe. And for some modern peoples whose languages descend from that family. We will get more precise now in a minute. Then pagan, that is another slippery word. When I say pagan here, I am talking about non-Christian religious worldviews, non-patriarchal monotheistic religious worldviews, both historical and modern. Inside that, we have at least two important shapes of belief: animism and polytheism. So animism means a worldview that is full of persons, entities, individuals, only some of whom are human. So we have spirits of place, ancestors, beings in river and hill and sky and stone and mountain. And polytheism means many gods, really, relating to many distinct deities with their own names, their own stories, their own agency, their own autonomy, rather than one single god or a vague, the universe or Gaia energy, right? So historical Celtic cultures show both of these patterns in slightly different ways at different times. Modern movements that call themselves Celtic pagan also mix and match them in their own fashion. We will keep circling back to those words as we go. So do not worry if it feels like a lot. You are not here for a degree or an exam. You are here to get clear enough so that you can make good choices for yourself, your beliefs, your own spiritual practices. So, what do we actually mean by the Celts? Oh, whoops. Historically, the word was first used by Greek and Roman writers. You will sometimes see the Greek word Keltoi mentioned. They were talking about an Indo-European ethno-linguistic grouping in parts of Europe. So that is a fancy way to say different tribal groups who shared enough in language and material culture, the artifacts, the things that they used, that scholars can see clearly that they are related. Now, they were not one united empire. There was no central Celtic king or parliament where everyone agreed on the best practice for worshipping the gods. We are talking about many local tribal communities with their own customs, trading, fighting, intermarrying and influencing each other over a very long stretch of time. So when somebody on social media talks about nonsense like the ancient Celts believed XYZ, a good question to ask yourself is, which group of ancient Celts? Where? When? Because it will usually turn out that what they really mean is, this sounds cool and vaguely old. And, that's not what we want. We demand better. We deserve better. So to place all of this in historical time, we're going to look briefly at the Bronze Age. This is after a couple of epochs of the Stone Age. There were a few different Stone Ages, and then we had the Bronze Age. So across parts of Europe, we see Bronze Age cultures from roughly 3200 BCE or before Common Era down to about 600 BCE. The date definitely shift a bit by region because archaeology is based on what is actually dug up from the ground, not on a tidy calendar blocks, so they can only match the dating to what they happen to have found in the archaeology, if that makes sense. In Atlantic Europe, which includes like Portugal, North Spain, France, Britain and Ireland, we are looking at about 1300 to 700 BCE for the shared Atlantic Bronze Age pattern. Now, please remember, this is not an exact science. We do have to generalize here because we just don't have the information that we would love to have, archaeologically speaking. So, scholars talk about proto-Celtic influences appearing in this period. That means that we can see some early hints in language or linguistic remains, in artifacts, of ideas that will later show up more clearly in what we classify or call the Celtic cultures. But nobody in the Bronze Age was walking around saying, "Hi, I'm a Celt." These labels are all modern academic tools, so please keep that front and centre. They are useful, but only if we remember that they're tools, not feckin' bloodlines. We'll get to that in a minute. For us as modern practitioners, the key point in all of this is the roots of what we call Celtic culture are deep, they are complicated, they are shared across multiple regions. There is no single original Celtic religion that we could possibly extract from this time period and just plug into our living room altars today, okay? So from there we move into Iron Age Europe, and moving forward, this is where the picture kind of sharpens a little bit. That may have been a metallurgy joke. Archaeologists often talk about two big cultural phases here. Hallstatt from about 800 to about 450 BCE. It's on my slides. Yes, it is. 450 BCE. And then La Tène from about 450 to about like 1 BCE or 0 Common Era, the start of the Common Era. BCE is before Common Era. CE is Common Era. These are modern historical and archaeological terms that are non-religious. So they would have been historically referred to as BC and AD, based around the supposed time of Jesus. So we've just gone a little bit neutral with those terms in modern academia, which is no harm. So Hallstatt and La Tène are labels that are based on distinctive artifact styles and art, cultural styles and burial patterns, and they're named after key sites in Europe. This is where the swirling kind of metalwork and weaponry that many folk think of as Celtic art really shows up in the historical record. And running alongside and then after these phases, we have the Roman period. So roughly about 1 to 375 Common Era in much of Europe. And Roman cultural expansion brought invasion, trade, and honestly pressure. A lot of local tribal gods within these Celtic cultures ended up equated with Roman deities in inscriptions and temple dedications. Unfortunately, then a lot of the original material may have been lost. Then from there, we move into what historians such as myself call the early medieval period, when Christianity really starts to take hold in Europe. In Ireland, that is roughly from the 400s onwards. Now, we did have Christian missionaries here from probably the 300s, possibly before, but at least from the 300s, but they were coming to be kind of solo ascetic lifestyle, monks in their little beehive huts. There was very small settlements maybe, but really from the 400s onward in Ireland is when we start to see Christianity taking a foothold. And it wasn't with the coming of St. Patrick. I know that's a common misconception. St. Patrick was not all that. And we don't have to go into that in this video. Anyway, there was a long, messy overlap between older practices, pagan practices here in Ireland, and this new religion. So when you imagine Celtic pagans in history, you're not looking at one frozen moment, not at all. You're looking at centuries of change, from local chiefs and warrior bands converting right through to the monks copying Latin texts in monasteries that sit right on top of older pre-Christian sacred sites that they have basically claimed. Now, Iron Age artefacts. On this slide, you can see a very small sampling of Irish Iron Age artefacts. We have some bits of horse gear. We have some weapons, collection of swords, some decorative pieces. And these are the kind of high status objects that tend to survive because they're made of metal and because somebody at some point put them carefully in the ground or into water. So for modern pagans, there is a temptation to treat every object or every fancy object that we can find through the archaeology as some kind of guaranteed ritual tool. Archaeologists are quite a bit more cautious, even when things were obviously ritual, just generic object was the label or the classifications. Some archaeologists didn't want to put a pagan label on a lot of the stuff that was being found. Sometimes, though, an item was used clearly in a sacred context. But sometimes it's just a very nice piece of everyday kit belonging to someone who was important. And sometimes we genuinely just don't know. So again, it is about honest limits. We can say that there is evidence of skilled craft, of status, of connections here in Ireland with the wider Latin art world. We have a few stones that have survived that have specific Latin artwork on them, such as Castle Strange in County Roscommon, among others. So we can say that there were people in Iron Age Ireland who were using and valuing these things. We cannot say that this is exactly how they created sacred space, or this proves that all Celts believed this specific thing or in this specific deity. And if you're building a practice today, that honesty is part of right relationship, and your education about the history, the true history of Ireland or Celtic cultures, also part of right relationship. You can't be going around making shit up. okay, just because it suits you or you want to. So we start from what the land and the evidence actually give us, not from what we wish was true or what we need to be true. So we're going to come back to this Celt word. And as I have said already, the first written mention was Greek. So it was from Hecataeus of Miletus, a Greek geographer writing about a people he calls the Celtoi around 517 BCE, there or thereabouts. He is an outsider, mind you, describing neighbours. He's not a Celtic spokesperson. And when we do have written historical records, this is often the problem, where the academic observers and the elite who had the time and the space to go around studying, learning, writing shit down, they were not the actual people that they were describing. And they would often misinterpret things. They would often have misconceptions or biases. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And those are the records that we have. So if we fast forward all the way to the last few centuries, you get modern scholars. And I say modern in loose terms because it really was from 1800s. But they're using Celtic as a cultural ID, which is based on language families, art styles, classical texts, material artifacts, archaeological remnants, what we know of their social organisation, and, to a certain extent, the mythology that we know. So there are two layers here. One is how ancient neighbours or conquerors often labelled certain groups. And the other is how modern academics, mostly from, again, colonising powers, such as the Protestant ascendancy here in Ireland, have sorted archaeological finds and languages into these neat, tidy categories that suited them. But neither of those are the same as the ways living Irish, Welsh, Breton, Scottish, or Manx communities understand ourselves today. So if you're approaching this from outside, a really respectful step is to listen and learn from actual contemporary Celtic language communities. Find out how we talk about our cultures, how our language has evolved, how we are using or interpreting our own culture from the inside, rather than assuming that the 19th century romantic Protestant idea of the Celtic soul is accurate in any way. Now, this is the bit where people are going to be pissed off with me. What's new on the internet? All of that sets up for a very important slide, not a race. This might be the single most crucial takeaway from this little class. It is very important to understand this. The term Celtic is about culture and language. It is not scientifically, historically, in any way, academically or provably, a genetic category. There's no such thing as pure Celtic blood. You don't have it. Your ancestors didn't have it. It's just not a thing. Modern population genetics shows that neighbours are usually more similar to each other than to their own siblings. Humans move. We mix and we migrate. This is what we do. So just think about that for a second. If you do genetic testing on two siblings, even twins in some cases, they might have less genetic markers in common than the people who live down the road from the siblings. And that's just how genetics works. So when you hear people using Celtic as code for white, white supremacy or talking about defending the purity of Celtic heritage, Celtic races, Ireland is full, all of that crap, or using triskells or ravens alongside fascist imagery. That is not cultural pride. That is racism wearing a cloak of mythology. They're hiding behind the history, the heritage to further their racist, misogynist, all of those beliefs that they hold so dear to their hearts. But ultimately, it's about white supremacy. Those people are not protecting my culture. They don't know my history. One recent study here has found that a lot of the accounts online in Ireland and Britain who are promoting these kind of Celtic or Irish purity sentiments, these racist ideologies, they're not even based in Ireland or Britain. They're usually American there was one where there was a guy in Sri Lanka using Britain's racism and rage bait, clickbait, to get clicks and views so that he was earning a rake of money off ads, right? So these people who are picking this up, lapping it up, are not protecting my culture, definitely not. They are abusing it to justify misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, white supremacy. They do not get to claim the ancestors. If you have been pulled towards Irish or other Celtic traditions, this is where you check yourself. Are you here because you want a spiritual path rooted in real places, languages, communities, or are you looking for a fantasy of being special or superior in some way? And it is a fantasy. That's the modern myth. Because only one of those people is welcome in this space. Let's be very blunt about it. You don't get to learn from the Irish Pagan School and be racist. So, on this map, you can see the main areas that people usually mean when they talk about Celtic nations today, our Celtic cousins. We have Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, the Isle of Man, and Brittany. So Brittany down here is in France. These are the places where Celtic languages have survived into the modern era. So we have Irish, Gaeilge, Scots Gaelic, Welsh, Cornish, Manx, and Breton. And if you take nothing else from this slide, remember that these are living cultures. These are people speaking these languages at their kitchen tables, raising children in them, creating new music, poetry, and ritual in them right now. And also please notice that I am not calling this map the British Isles. That name reflects a particular colonial history. I prefer the Celtic Isles personally, but you can call it whatever you want except the British Isles. And anybody who comes into the comments and says that is geographically correct, fuck you. Honestly, you will be blocked, you will be deleted, absolutely, 100%. Because I am educating you about a colonial term that was put upon us here in Ireland particularly, but not just in Ireland. And you can simply refer to these islands when we're talking about geography, okay? If you come from here, your relationship with this land and its stories will be different from someone approaching it from the diaspora or from another continent entirely. And that's fine. There's room for all of that. As long as we're honest about where we're standing, don't be pretending you're from Ireland to stir up racist crap on Facebook or any of the other horribly appropriative things that we see happening. Any authentic approach to Celtic spirituality, Celtic paganism, has to start by locating itself in relation to these real communities, not just in TikTok aesthetics. So let's start there. We're going to talk about how people in these cultures related to the sacred. We've mentioned some of these terms. We're going to look into them a bit more. One core pattern that we can see, especially in earlier material, is animism. Celtic peoples honoured the forces of nature as living entities. We have rivers with goddess names, wells that received offerings, hilltops and groves that clearly mattered enough for people to bury precious things in there. They saw the world as full of many spirits. And when you walk through an old Irish story, you don't just meet the human characters and a god or two. You meet the she-folk. You also meet land spirits. Those are different things. You meet ancestral heroes, prophetic dream figures, otherworldly animals who all have their own agency and their own autonomy. They were individual beings. So the divine shows up through the natural world. A goddess is not just in the river. She may, in some sense, be the river. When you interact with that water, you are not engaging with a symbol of divinity. You are dealing with a real being who has preferences and power, who is the river. In the earlier layers of evidence that we have, those divine forces were often unshaped or unnamed, or certainly their names have not survived. We don't have neat statues of every local deity. Instead, we get sacred places, offerings, and sometimes vague titles like the god of this ford, something like that. It is later in the Roman period and beyond that we see more anthropomorphic depictions. For your practice, this means that if you want to be in right relationship with Celtic traditions, you could start by meeting your local land as a community of persons, not as a backdrop or a stage to do your rituals on. And that's a very different starting point from how do I plug in this ready-made Celtic ritual script into this stage setting that I'm on. Alongside that animist sense of a full spirited world, we also see clear polytheism. By the late Iron Age and into the Roman period again, we have inscriptions naming specific gods and goddesses. Sorry, keep doing that. We have evidence of priestly classes, what classical authors refer to as druids, fulfilling roles within the societies that range from judges and poets and healers to ritual specialists to prophets or diviners to battle magicians when the tribes went to war. And shrines and sanctuaries appear in particular places. So we have hilltops, lakes, groves of trees specifically. Sacrifices were made, oaths were sworn, divine protection was being sought. In the Irish material, particularly, once we get into the medieval manuscripts, which, yes, were written down by Christian monks in the early medieval, but recorded a much older oral tradition on the island, we start to meet named beings like Lugh, like Breege, like the Dagda, like the Morrigan, like Monaghan MacLear, who is an interesting crossover between Irish and Manx, or the Isle of Man, and many more. They interact with human heroes, they shape battles, they demand hospitality, they mess around with us, and sometimes they just make a complete mess of things. Now, again, these stories were written down by these Christian monks centuries often after the supposed time of the tales. So we do have to be careful. This isn't a pure, clear, clean window into pre-Christian belief. It's coloured by the scribes who wrote it down, the same way that classical authors, their biases coloured the Celtic tribes that they were witnessing. So what we have is more like a kind of a stained glass window that has been moved and repaired, but you can still see the shapes. So for a modern polytheist, somebody who believes in multiple gods, the important question is not, can I reconstruct the exact Iron Age ritual calendar and stick the word Celtic on it? The question really has to be, how do I show up in relationship with these deities in a way that respects their origins and the living cultures that are still tied to them? The Morrigan, for example, is a particularly Irish goddess. If you're following a Welsh path or a Cornish path of magic or spirituality, then the Morrigan doesn't have a place there. She's Irish. So you have to look at all of these things, look at the history, look at the context of them. And it's going to look different for an Irish person living beside an old sacred site than it does for someone in the US Midwest. Both are valid, but they're not interchangeable. Everybody has to find their own path with the material. Now, Celtic neo-paganism, after all that historical context, what on earth are we supposed to do with Celtic neo-paganism? Because that is what most people online actually mean when they say Celtic paganism. They're talking about modern religious movements inspired by bits and pieces of older Celtic cultures, but built in very contemporary ways, and often by people who are completely outside those original cultures. Now, some of those movements are careful, well researched and accountable to living communities, and others are horrifically not that. So let's talk frankly about some of the main strands and where the problems and the possibilities lie. Again, to inform people, not to throw shade on anyone. On this slide, you can see a short list. So we have Celtic reconstructionism, which is akin to Gaelic reconstructionism. There's some small differences in there. Too much to go into really on this video, but I just wanted to put them both up there. We have Celtic neoshamanism, Celtic Wicca, the faerie faith, as it's called, often with various spellings of faerie, and neo-Druidism. So the labels overlap a bit, and every group will tell you that their version is the good one, obviously, is the proper one, is the right one, is the correct one. And I'm not here to crown a winner or a loser. I am here to give you some tools to assess what you are looking at. So the Celtic reconstructionism or Gaelic reconstructionism, at its best, tries to work as closely as possible with historical sources, language, archaeology, and living cultural knowledge to build a modern polytheistic practice, usually. It knows that it's modern, but it usually has good boundaries about not claiming to be the same as what our Iron Age ancestors did. When done ethically, this can absolutely be a solid path. Celtic neo-shamanism is more complicated. So it comes out of 20th century core shamanism, where people tried to extract supposed universal techniques from many indigenous cultures and then paste Celtic names and imagery over the top, usually some kind of mishmash of various Celtic cultures. There can be helpful journey work tools in there, but if you're using colonized people's sacred terms like shaman for your paid Celtic workshop, that is a problem. You can do trance and spirit work without stealing other people's words and frameworks, and I would urge you to find ways to do that. Now, Celtic Wicca grows out of British traditional Wicca from the mid-20th century, which already mixes bits of ceremonial magic, folklore, personal innovation of the founders such as Gerald Gardner. It obviously moved from Britain to the States, and you had some significant eclectic Wicca stuff happening in there. So when we see the Celtic bit on here, it usually means that the god names and festival language have been swapped out for more Gaelic flavoured ones, usually either Irish or Scottish. That does not magically make it an indigenous Irish tradition. It is still Wicca with a Celtic paint job, basically. And look, that's fine as long as you're honest about it. Know exactly what you're doing. I have had people claim to be like descendants of unbroken lineages from ancient Druids in Ireland. And it's dishonest. It's palpably misleading, arrogant, ridiculous to anybody who knows anything about Irish history, Irish genetics, Irish ancestry research. It's just ridiculous. Fairy faith is another loose label. There are some very careful practitioners, and I indeed myself have used the term Irish fairy faith, such as in my book on the topic. We have people like Morgan Daimler in the US, whose work takes Irish and Scottish, usually sources, very seriously. But there is also a lot of pure fantasy out there that treats the good neighbours, Nadini Maha, the other crowd, as some sort of sparkly therapy friends with positive vibes. If your fairy path ignores the actual Irish, Scottish, Manx, Welsh lore about the, what we call in Ireland, the Aes people of the Mounds, as powerful, morally complicated neighbours who can help or more usually wreck you, you're not in a Celtic tradition at all. You are in somebody's personal fantasy. Maybe that's your own. Maybe it's somebody else's who has led you down some sort of Victorian garden path. Look, that is your own business, but do not sell it as our business, okay? Now, Neo-Druidism covers a huge range of groups, many of which began even as early as the 18th and 19th century, where we had English and Welsh upper-class gentlemen playing at being ancient priests, using some very bad history and really dodgy bedsheets. Some modern Druid orders have done hard work to decolonise and realign with better scholarship and with living Celtic communities. I mean, I can think of one who is trying to do that moving forward, but their historical work, their body of teaching is still woefully out of date and misaligned with anything Irish or Celtic. Others are very much still centering English romantic nationalism while sprinkling in the odd Irish goddess name or Welsh. So where does that leave you if you feel called here? First, slow your roll. Slow the feck down on claiming titles. Do have a really good video on this channel that my partner John did, which is something along the lines of Do we need titles in Irish paganism? I'll link it in the cards after this video when you watch to the end. But you don't need to call yourself a druid, a shaman, a Celtic priestess to do meaningful spiritual work. In fact, you probably shouldn't, especially for the first couple of years. Now, second, look at who you are learning from. Are they citing real sources from the actual cultures? Are they academically sound or centuries out of date, cherry-picked to somehow make themselves correct? Are they really clear about what is historical, what is modern practice, and what is their own personal gnosis? And that's a kind way, in some cases, of saying just their fantasy projections. Do they acknowledge colonization and cultural appropriation as real forces that they need to be aware of and avoid? And then third, ask yourself why you want the word Celtic in your religion, in your spirituality. If it is about connecting with specific lands, languages, and peoples or ancestry or culture in a respectful way, and brilliant, use it. But if it's because it feels more marketable, more mystical, than being honest about where your practice actually really comes from, i.e., I've made it up, or it's what I believe and I want to share it, that's not so grand. You're fooling people, you're conning people. Now, the channel that you're watching here, the Irish Pagan School, exists because myself and John were absolutely sick, fed up to our back teeth of watching people package fantasy versions of our traditions and attempting to sell them back to us. It worked in the 80s and the 90s. A lot of Irish people were taken in by Celtic shamanism in particular, and traditional Wicca or Celtic Wicca to a certain extent definitely took a hold here. But whatever path you choose to follow, whatever your spiritual beliefs are, please don't repeat those patterns. Please learn, honour, practice, but don't set yourself up as an expert on cultures that you are still only beginning to understand. Don't put yourself in a position of trying to teach to other people in your community or at festivals from cultures that are not your own. Honestly, you haven't got the right to it, regardless of your ancestry. Again, pure Celtic blood is not a thing. Your 23andMe report, unfortunately, doesn't really mean much. It is valid for you, but it's not valid as some kind of license or title to claim expertise in a living tradition that has developed and grown and is very much surviving and thriving in the home space of it long after your ancestors left. Okay? Please learn. There is an open door to learn, to connect, to build relationship. That's literally my life's work and John's life's work. We try to give people authentic access. We started the Irish Pagan School where there's 10 different teachers who have all taught classes with us. So it's not just my word or John's word. We provide a platform for other Irish teachers as well. But I really want you to understand that Celtic paganism in the real world is not a single ancient religion that you can just download or plug into. It is a modern phrase that sits on top of a long, messy, beautiful, complicated history of related cultures, languages, and stories. So if you want to walk a path here, you have some choices. You can commit to learning about the actual historical and modern Celtic cultures, absolutely. You can respect that the term Celtic is cultural and linguistic, it's not racial. You can build a practice that is honest about what we know, what we don't know, and what you are creating or growing in your own life from these genuine roots and seeds. Or you can chase a fantasy of some ancient pan-Celtic priesthood that never existed. You can demand initiation from whoever shouts loudest online and call it ancestral because you bought a DNA test. I can't stop you. You are free to do those things. But I also will not pretend that is right relationship with these traditions, and I will absolutely call it out where I see it. So if you are still listening at this point, if I haven't completely alienated you, you may be our people. I'm guessing that you are at least leaning towards the first options. So Gura Mahagut, thank you for spending this time with me. Thank you for educating yourself. Thank you for using the free tools and resources that are part of my life's work, my decades and decades of learning myself so that I can teach to other people, of living in the culture for almost 5 decades now. And if you want to keep learning in a way that centres Irish voices and our genuine, authentic, living spiritual traditions, you are very welcome to join us over at irishpaganschool.ie in our free community space there. Just join up. It's absolutely free. You can meet other people. You can ask questions. You can continue to mind yourself, mind each other, and please remember the gods, the land, the ancestors are watching what we do with their names and in their name. A little bit scary, I know, but it's true. Hopefully I will see you at irishpaganschool.ie/community. If you want to take a class, those are at irishpaganschool.com. The links will all be below, so please make sure that you avail of these free and paid resources. And I will see you in the next video. Slán.